Hey guys, Will here. So welcome back to part 2 of our Fanatec DD2 wheelbase review. So today's video, we're going to be focusing more heavily on the software and ecosystem side of things. Now, as you would have seen this morning, Fanatec actually released a brand new beta version of their drivers, version 3.5.2. So just wanted to clear something up there straight away. I've had early access to these drivers for 3 or 4 days now, been able to experiment with these, and those are the drivers that I've based all of my impressions on for the forthcoming video. So all of what you'll be seeing in today's video, as well as my driving impressions video tomorrow, is all based off these brand new drivers that have been released this morning from Fanatec. So just quickly cover off a couple of things. I've just got my cheat notes here in front of me because this is a really important update from Fanatec. And as you'll see throughout the course of this video, it's something that has really dramatically changed the overall impressions of this wheelbase. When I first drove it, as I said yesterday in the hardware overview video, I wasn't particularly impressed, to be honest with you guys. It really didn't feel all that much better from the Club Sport wheelbase 2.5 that I was used to. But yeah, these drivers made an absolute difference. So as I quickly mentioned in yesterday's video, what I did when I first fired up the wheelbase is I installed some older drivers, and then I sort of progressively went through up until the most up-to-date drivers, the ones that were released this morning, to sort of see how much of a difference it makes. And I can tell you absolutely unequivocally that it makes an absolutely massive difference. So let's just quickly go through a couple of things that they've changed here, and I'll put a link to the announcement in the description below for you as well. So they've reduced the overall force feedback latency by 23%, which is pretty darn significant. They've increased the resolution of the force feedback signal to 16-bit from 8-bit, so we now have 65,536 increments instead of the 256 increments that we had previously. So that is also very significant, and this is what's going to account for what I talk about in this video as well as tomorrow's video, where we reference a sort of robotic feeling that I had when I initially was using the wheelbase. Obviously, having more increments gives us more point of reference throughout the turning cycle, and yeah, it really does improve things massively. So improved force feedback linearity as well. We also have a new little switch that we'll be looking at today for a linearity setting, so we'll check that out. So another note here, improved motor control with significantly less loss to resemble the raw force feedback signal more precisely. Simply described, the previous motor handling acted like a slight filter on noisy force feedback, but also reduced the detail. One-to-one game force feedback can be quite rough and noisy. Therefore, we've added a new filter to the tuning manual called force interpolation, and we'll be talking about that a lot in today's video. Basically, what that means is that you know, the data that's coming out of sim software can be quite robotic, and it's up to the drivers and the software to filter that. And we talked about that a lot in our force feedback explained video, where we covered the TrueDrive software from SimiCube as well. So it's certainly something that is not unique to Fanatec. It's something that affects all direct drive wheelbases due to the nature of not having the dampening effect of the cogs or pulleys and you know, belts and things like that. When you've got a motor connected directly to a shaft, you literally feel every single little detail that's being transmitted through the motor. So that makes the filters a lot more important. So a couple other little notes here as well: improved spring effect calculation, improved damper effect calculation, and improved natural friction calculation as well. So the new features included linearity mode, as we mentioned just before, the new force interpolation, as well as the new natural inertia setting as well. So we'll be looking at all of that in detail in today's video, so stick around. Okay, so we've got the wheelbase installed on the cockpit now, and I've actually already recorded my first drive impressions of the wheelbase. I've actually done a lot of recording over the last 3 days, but what I decided to do is present this a little bit out of order from how I filmed it, simply because there were some things that I learned throughout the first drive experience with this wheelbase that I think are really relevant to this section of the video where we're talking about software. There's some things that I think you really need to understand before we get into our first drive, because it will definitely have an impact on how you are sort of, I guess, impressed by this wheelbase the first time you drive it as well. So we'll jump in now and talk about the software side of things. So first thing you need to do is make sure that you are running the most recent drivers. Now, what I did initially is I jumped on the website and just installed the most recent full release drivers. And what I found is that the experience with driving the wheelbase actually wasn't all that impressive, to be honest with you guys. It felt quite sort of robotic and grainy. And I did spend quite a bit of time fiddling around with the settings, and I just really couldn't tune that out initially. And so look, to be honest with you guys, my first impression
of the wheelbase wasn't all that good compared with the Simucube 2 Ultimate that I've been using previously. And obviously my expectations were not necessarily all that high compared to the Simucube Ultimate, with the Ultimate obviously being a much more expensive wheelbase, but I expected it to feel a lot better than it did initially. And what I did then was I experimented a little bit with drivers and realized that the more recent beta version drivers actually fixed a lot of those, I won't say problems, but they've improved things a lot. So what I realized is just how much is done in software as opposed to hardware here. Now, we kind of touched on this a little bit when I did my force feedback explain video a number of months ago now. I really sort of explained to you guys just how much software filtering and adjustment really goes in the back end to make what you're feeling through the wheel actually feel realistic. Now, particularly with direct drive wheelbases, because you're basically holding onto a wheel which is connected to a shaft which is connected directly to a motor, all those little nuances and details inside the, that have been transmitted to the motor is exactly what you feel. Now, with a belt-driven or cog-driven wheelbase, there's a little bit of leeway there because you get a bit of a dampening effect through the drivetrain of the wheelbase, whereas obviously with a direct drive wheelbase, you don't have that benefit. So it comes down a lot more to the fine-tuning of the software and the firmware as well to make sure that what you're feeling is as realistic as possible. So when I upgraded to version 3.46 of the driver software, so a beta version, the entire driving experience was completely different. So this kind of opens up a little bit of a can of worms for me, to be honest, because I know that, obviously things are progressing throughout time as we move on, and Fanatec is releasing more new drivers. And what this kind of tells me is that a lot of the first driving and experience videos and reviews for that matter that you've seen in the past might not necessarily be indicative of the driving experience that you'll have when you actually purchase yours. So obviously things are being improved over time, and even just between the, I think it was the 3.40 driver and the 3.46 driver that I tried, there was a absolutely massive, night and day difference between the driving experience. I wouldn't say all of the robotic feeling, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we do go for our drive and I give you my impressions. But a lot of the robotic feeling that I was feeling through this wheelbase was remedied by installing the later driver versions. And I'm actually running an internal version of the driver now. By the time you see this video, hopefully this driver will be released. But the takeaway here is that very much the software plays a massive part in here and what you feel through the wheelbase, particularly with direct drive wheelbases. So make sure you are getting on and downloading the most recent beta driver version from the Fanatec forums. Now, you also want to make absolutely sure that you upgrade your firmware across all of your Fanatec devices as well. It's very important that you match the firmware version with the driver version that you're running as well. So that's a very simple process. You simply just click on the update tab and then run through the various different update options there. It's all very self-explanatory, and yeah, you can't really go wrong with that. Flashing firmware can be a little bit scary at times, but there's checks and balances in place so that if you do get a bad flash, you can go back into bootloader mode and reload the firmware. So you don't need to be too nervous about that. But let's have a look now at the software packages and exactly what you get in, first of all, the drivers, and then we'll have a look at Fanalab as well. So once you've got your drivers all installed, you'll double click on the Fanatec wheel property icon on your desktop, and you'll be presented with the generic Windows game controller console as you see here. Now you can see I've got all these various different devices that are showing up here. I've got my pedals and my shifter connected separately to the wheelbase, so I haven't actually got them plugged into the wheelbase. I'm running them through their own USB interface. The reason for that is because it works better for me swapping between the Simucube and the DD2 if I have my pedals and my shifter connected via USB. So that is the reason why you can see all those different devices here. The Arduino Leonardo that you see there is my button box. So one thing that you will notice here is that you've got the Fanatec Podium Wheelbase DD2 showing up twice in the menu here. Now that is perfectly normal. The reason for that is because you've got so many different communication channels running, it actually needs to detect it as two devices. And that's nothing new for Fanatec devices. It's always been that way. At least it was that way with my CSW 2.5 as well. But I've seen a few posts in online forums and stuff like that, people are a little bit confused about this, thinking that there's something wrong. So all you need to do is highlight one of the DD2 wheelbase icons, it doesn't matter which one, and click on properties, and you'll be presented with the Fanatec wheel properties console here. So you've got a bunch of different options here. This will be familiar to most people already. You've got your steering wheel LED test, your segment display test, your FFB or force feedback test as well, and that does definitely rattle things around a little bit. And then what you have here is basically just an interface for testing all your various different buttons and things. So you can see if I press buttons on the wheel, they all show up on the little blue panels there on the button module. And then if I turn the wheel, you can see there the steering wheel adjustment moves. And then you can see with my analog movements there, if I move that stick around the hat switch, you can see that moves there as well. The funky switch shows up as the D-pad and so forth. Then we click across to settings next. So if this is your first time using your wheel, you want to make absolutely sure you click on erase motor calibration and then motor center calibration and wheel center calibration as well. That's really important to make sure that obviously your wheel's centered in the middle as well as your motor sensor is all calibrated correctly as well, so you don't get any weird behavior when you go and drive. Next, we want to click across to tuning menu here. Now this is where all the magic happens. So here we have all of our adjustments to how the force feedback is going to feel at a driver level. Obviously you have your adjustments inside the games themselves as well, which has an influence, but this is the driver level adjustment here. Now obviously one of the big advantages of the Fanatec ecosystem is that you can also adjust all of these things from your wheel itself as well. Depending on the wheel you have will depend on how exactly it shows up on the display. But when we press on our tuning menu button on our wheel, you can see we have our 5 different profiles that show up on the screen, and those match the 5 different profiles here in the device setup as well. And then we can tab through with our funky switch and adjust each of those. Now if we adjust them here on the fly, you can see it actually adjusts on the software as well. So that is really cool and something that is definitely unique to Fanatec, at least at this point in time. And really, really useful to be able to adjust these settings on the fly while you're driving. You can even do things like if you're drifting, for example, you can adjust your drifting settings while you're actually driving. So you could leave, for example, your display on the drift mode setting, and then you can make a little adjustment with the funky switch while you're actually driving, which is something that, at least to my knowledge, you can't do with any other platform at this point in time, any other ecosystem. So that is something that is really cool and something that will be beneficial to a lot of people, I'm sure, with the Fanatec ecosystem. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on as well. Now we do, as I mentioned before, have our 5 different profiles here. Now one thing that I've seen a few people complain about here is that 5 profiles isn't really enough, particularly if you're setting up profiles for lots of different cars and things like that as well. But as you'll see when we go into the Fanalab software in just a moment, you can actually set up profiles for individual games as well as multiple profiles which you can switch between and import and export as well. So you can even send profiles to your friends. So you can set up infinite profiles in the Fanalab software and then load those back to your wheelbase and wheel once you're all ready to go. So you can set up profiles of different cars, pretty much everything. Sky's the limit. You can set up an infinite number of profiles there. So we'll just quickly run through the various different options that we have available to us here. We've got steering angle here, and we do have a little question mark button here in the driver now too, which is really useful. Pops up with a little dialogue telling us exactly what each of these settings do. So we don't need to go into a massive amount of detail here for you right now. Obviously we have our steering angle, which is the amount that the wheel turns in relation to how much you're turning in real life. Now this goes all the way up to a massive 2,520 degrees now. And I actually asked Thomas from Fanatec the other day exactly why it needs to go that far. And he said a lot of people are buying these wheelbases to use with truck simulators where you're going around and round and round and round. So that's a really powerful feature for those who might be using truck simulators. For me, generally I leave it set to automatic. If I have any problems with the automatic setting, I adjust it down to around the 900 degrees. For Formula 1 cars, I have it down more towards a sort of 360 degree mark. Force feedback overall strength setting. So this is pretty much exactly what it says it is. It's the strength of the force feedback that you feel through the wheel relative to the signals that are coming out of the game. Now, obviously, generally you can adjust this in the game as well. What most people suggest is that you have it set to 100% inside the game and then adjust it to your preference from here. We've got force feedback linearity as well, which is a on or off setting. Now, this is a really cool one. This allows us to adjust static forces. So it's very similar to this static force reduction setting that you would have seen in my force feedback explain video with the SimuCube wheelbase. What this allows us to do, as it says here, is reduce the maximum amount of possible torque output to a level which generates a linear and constant peak and holding torque forces. Parameter is on or off. So what this means is if you're going around a corner that is, a high static force or something like that, it reduces it a little bit so that you still feel the textures in the road. It's not completely overpowered by the static force of going around a corner. So that is something that I'll generally set to on, but I'm not going to run you through all of my settings here just yet because I am still fine tuning things. We've got our natural damper here, which is the amount of dampening that is applied universally. We've got a natural friction setting as well, which is the amount of resistance that you feel against the wheel while you're steering. So that is often adjusted inside the sim title as well, but you can add a little bit of natural friction there as well. Now, what I did find with the DD2 compared to the SimuCube wheelbase is that when I do increase that friction level, level, and it has been improved in the more recent drivers quite dramatically, but there is a little bit of notchiness that's introduced there. It does feel a little bit sort of robotic compared to the SimiCube platform. With my SimiCube 2 Ultimate, it feels completely smooth. It really genuinely feels like it's the weight of a steering rack that you're feeling, whereas with this, it kind of has a little bit of a robotic feeling there. It's not something that you notice when you're driving so much, but it is just a little difference that I did feel between the DD2 and the SimiCube 2 Ultimate that I wanted to point out there. So then we have a natural inertia setting as well, which obviously influences the amount of inertia that you feel with the wheel, or its ability to sort of flick as you turn. Gets a little bit heavier as you turn more sharply, things like that. Now we have our force feedback interpolation filter. So this is a setting that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail, simply because this is an absolute game changer when it comes to direct drive wheelbases, whether it's a Fanatec wheelbase, a SimiCube, or even the open source wheel platforms that a lot of you guys might be familiar with. A lot of the guys that are familiar with the SimiCube 1 will tell you that when they introduced the force reconstruction filter, that was an absolute game changer for direct drive wheelbases, and it's exactly the same here as well with the DD1 and DD2. So what this is essentially doing is interpolating data, or creating additional data in between the packets of data that are coming out of the force feedback information in your sim title. So what that means is that even though the data that's coming out of the sim itself might be quite notchy and grainy, this is actually filtering that and sort of going, all right, well, if I've got this bit of data and then I've got this bit of data, and there's quite a difference between the two, you can imagine if there's a big difference between the two packets of data, you might get a sudden jerk or feel that kind of robotic notchiness. When what the interpolation filter does is it goes, all right, I'm going to take an average, or I mean, it's a lot more complicated than this in real life, but it's going to say, all right, I've got this data and I've got this data, so I'm going to interpolate between those two packets of data to sort of create what I think you should feel throughout the two. Now, in real life, what that means is that if you turn this up too far, it kind of smooths everything out a little bit too much and it feels a little bit kind of loose. If you have it turned down too low, then you get the raw data that's coming out of the sim. So essentially, you're relying on the sim's force feedback data to provide exactly what you're feeling through the wheelbase. And again, this sort of brings us back to the point we were making about belt-driven or cog-driven wheelbases compared to direct drive wheelbases. With direct drive wheelbases, because what you're feeling through the motor is exactly what is being outputted to the motor, this becomes a lot more important. So having that filter around the sort of middle range, and it was exactly the same with SimCube as well with their force reconstruction filter, having it around the middle makes it feel quite nice, makes it feel nice and smooth. It gets rid of a lot of that robotic feeling without it sort of losing any detail. So this really is important to sort of dial in, and you'll find even between different sim titles, it'll make a massive difference. iRacing in particular, because that's running at 60 Hertz for the force feedback data, does tend to lean towards a little bit more of a robotic feeling. So having this set to around the middle does make a big difference there. Same deal with Race Room as well. I found having the interpolation filter makes a big difference there as well. So that is a little bit more about the interpolation filter. Let's have a look at some of the other settings now. So force effect intensity, this is a setting that's often reduced, again, to reduce that kind of robotic feeling that you get through the wheel. Less important now that you have the interpolation filter. So I've actually found that I've been just leaving it at 100 and it's been absolutely fine. And then we have our self-explanatory settings here, like force effect strength, spring effect strength, which is the springing effect of the wheel. We have our damper effect strength as well, which is a less universal setting, sort of adjusting the feeling that's coming out of the force feedback data from the game. And then we have our pedal vibration settings and our shock vibration strengths, which aren't really relevant to the DD2, so we'll leave those aside for now. We also have a setting here for multi-position switch, so that sets the mode of the multi-position switches, but we'll look at that when we do the review of the Porsche 911 GT3R wheel a little bit later on. So those are all the different settings that you have here. Now, if you do want to know any more detail about any of these settings in particular, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to do a more detailed video where we cover it in a lot more detail, but yeah, just really want to make sure that I'm clear that that force feedback interpolation filter is really, really important. Now, another thing that I want to draw attention to here as well, because I think it's really important, is that Fanatec do have some really great recommended settings for just about every sim platform that you can imagine as well. So if you jump on the net, go to Google and type in Fanatec settings, iRacing, Fanatec settings, you know, F1 2019, whatever it is that you're wanting to play, you'll see here in the forums there's a link that you can click on. And Fanatec have done a really good job of providing some recommended settings for a range of different wheelbases. You can see here we've got the DD1 for iRacing. We've got, if we scroll down, the DD2. And yeah, we've even got the wheelbase version 2. We've got a 2.5 there as well. So these are the recommended settings that they say as a base point. So just as I did before I went for my first drive, I would definitely recommend inputting these settings into your settings before you go for your first drive. If you don't do that, you're likely to not have the best experience. But they've done a really good job here of providing those settings for you. And of course, because it's a forum as well, people can comment. They can also add their own notes and things that they've been able to add that have sort of, you know, improved the feeling for their personal taste as well. So it's a really good community to get involved in if you're not already, but I would definitely recommend doing this. Now, one thing that I hope that they do add a little bit later on through the Fanalab software is these recommended profiles actually being in the software to begin with. So all you need to do is just click on the game that you want to play and it automatically loads these settings. SimuCube have a similar thing with their TrueDrive software at the moment. There was a couple of platforms there, or a couple of preloaded profiles, I should say, that I could click on straight away when I first loaded up the software, and that gave me a good starting point for where to sort of, I guess, make adjustments from there. So that is definitely something that I wanted to note there just quickly for you as well. Make sure you input these settings before you set off and get started. So we will just quickly do this now, just to make absolutely sure that I've got my settings set exactly the same. So I don't want to spend too much time here in Fanalab because a lot of this is a repeat of what we've already set up in the driver software, but there are a few key things that I do want to highlight here because this is a software package that I think has a lot of potential moving forward as well. Now, ultimately, I'm hoping what I'll see is that they'll integrate the driver and Fanalab together into one software package, so we're not sort of doubling up here. At the moment, it can be a little bit clumsy simply because you need to make sure that the version of Fanalab that you're running is compatible with the drivers that you're running, and you know, it creates the opportunity for a little bit of mismatching to go on here. And I found that when I was running Fanalab version 1.21, which is the version that's available on the Fanatec website right now, then I had some problems with compatibility with some of the other hardware running the newer beta driver software. So I think that it'll be a really good thing moving forward if Fanatec can integrate this all together into one software package. So when you install the driver, it also installs the correct version of Fanalab as well. But look, this is software that is very much in its infancy right now, and I'm sure that we'll see some massive improvements here over time. So on the main screen here, you can see we've got pictures of all the hardware that we have currently connected to the PC. Because I have my pedals connected via USB, you can see they're showing up there via USB, and then my shifter is connected as well. Now my handbrake is connected to my pedals via the handbrake port there, which is the reason why you're not seeing the handbrake show up, but the shifter is connected via the little USB dongle thing. So that's the reason why those aren't showing up under here. You can see we've got our DD2 showing up as well as our podium module endurance, or button module endurance. The pedals are not connected there, as I explained before, so that's the reason for that. Now, we also have this interesting little dashboard thing here, which I don't know much about just yet. It says coming soon still, but we'll definitely be covering that in more detail once it becomes available. Moving across to tuning menu. This is pretty much just a mirror of what we already looked at inside the driver software package before. So all of these adjustments here are exactly the same. And if we adjust them here, you'll see it adjust in the driver package as well, and vice versa. So again, we've got our 5 different profiles here that we can choose between. And then on the steering wheel here, we have our multi-position switch modes here, as well as our advanced paddle module modes here as well. Now, we covered that in detail when we did our advanced paddle module review video, showing the different modes for the analog clutches. And I will be covering that again when I do my Porsche 911 GT3R review as well. So moving across to dynamic force feedback, this is where we get some additional control over and above what the driver software gives us out of the box. So just having a quick little look at these now for you. Now, Fanatec have also added these little tooltip overlays as well. So when you hover over one of these settings, it explains exactly how to use it. So speed sensitivity applies a speed sensitive overlay damper effect to simulate the tires and gyroscopic forces. This can give a more realistic feeling on straights, as well as minimizing shaking and oscillations. Now, I did find when I did some driving testings that this did make a difference to that oscillation that you get in the wheel. So that is definitely something that you can experiment. I'm leaving this off for the most part because I found that with the interpolation filter in place, it wasn't quite such of a big deal. But again, personal preference here, you do want to spend some time doing some fine-tuning adjustment here. Speed threshold, the speed where the dampening overlay starts to take effect. So obviously the faster you're going, the more dampening you're going to feel. And this is the same in real life as well when you're driving a real car. The faster you're going, the less sort of fine detail you notice in the road surface because you're skimming over it a lot more quickly. So this kind of simulates that as well. Again, personal preference. Damper effect range. So this is the range of wheel angle away from the center where the dampening effect takes place. So obviously if you're turning more steeply, it will adjust for that as you're turning. So finer details will have more of a damper or less of a damper, depending on how you've got it set up there. Damper effect strength, that is pretty self-explanatory there. and then driving in reverse as well. So same settings again, but for driving in reverse. So a nice little addition there that you get through the Fanalab beta software, and it definitely does make a difference to the overall driving experience. So across to vibration. Now this is where you can set up all the various different vibration motors that you have inside various different wheels, as well as the V3 pedals if you have those. So we won't go into a lot of detail here for you now. If you do want to know more about that, let me know, and I'm happy to do a video covering that in more detail later on. But let's move across now to LEDs, because this is where some really cool things happen. So we can configure here, and again, Fanatec have a video where they go into a lot of detail about all of this, so I won't cover this in too much detail for you now. But we have a bunch of different telemetry which we can display on the OLED displays on our wheels, or the analog displays as well if you have one of the older style Fanatec wheels. So we have speed, RPM, fuel level, gear, anti-lock brake value, DRS allowed, pit limiting warning, traction control, lap number, position, sector, and ERS. Now what these little numbers here do is it allows us to set priority. So priority 1 will obviously be shown as priority number 1, priority 2, priority 3, and so forth. And then if you select the little X here, it means it won't be shown at all. Now we also have adjustments here for our flag LEDs for pit lane as well as pit limiter. So we can make those change different colors depending on what color we want. Obviously that is personal preference as well. That's set pretty realistically out of the box though. We also have our adjustments here for the RPM counter, so you can set the thresholds for that. And then under flag LEDs as well, we're able to take the raw data out of the sim and then use it to display some different colors and different patterns depending on what you want to do here as well. So say for example, when you're under blue flag conditions or yellow flag, red flag, green flag, white flag, or whatever on track, you can have all of that displayed on your wheel as well. So that is a really cool little addition as well. And again, as I said before, I think that we're only in the infancy of this Fanalab software at the moment. I think we're going to see a lot more stuff added over time. Now, one other really important thing here as well is game profiles. So this allows us to set up additional profiles in addition to the 5 that we have set under our device setup here. These are the ones that are selectable on the wheel itself, so you can switch between those while you're driving if you need to, or without having to alt tab out of the game. Now the game profiles, obviously you will need to alt tab out, but this allows us to set up multiple profiles of different games beyond the 5 profiles that we have built into the wheel. And even if you want to set up different profiles for different cars within a game as well, you can do that. Now there are people on the Fanatec forums as well that have even gone as far as setting up profiles that you can download for a lot of the different cars inside many of the sim titles as well. So as I said before, basically an infinite number of different profiles that you can set up here for different cars, different sim titles depending on your preference, and you can export them, share them with your friends, import them, and so forth. So really, really powerful stuff here in the Fanalab software. Now there is another exciting feature coming very soon as well. Now I can't talk about it in a lot of detail just yet, but we will definitely cover this in a lot of detail once it is fully released. But you can see this is something that is very unique and not offered on any other direct drive wheelbase as of right now.
Okay guys, so that is an overview of the brand new version 3.5.2 drivers from Fanatec, as well as version 1.22 of the Fanalab software. So there are still a couple of things that need to be sorted out with Fanalab. Obviously, you could see that it wasn't fully compatible with the endurance button module just yet. I do believe they're working on an update for that at the moment, so we should see that hopefully within the next week to coincide with the shipping of those Porsche rims. But it's a little bit beside the point for this video, but I just wanted to note that there for you guys quickly. But yeah, look, I think the big takeaway here is that the software really does play an absolutely massive role in the overall driving experience. And obviously we'll talk about that a lot more tomorrow when I do take you for the drive in various different sim titles. And yeah, I've kept that as a separate video simply because I want to spend quite a bit of time taking you through each sim and talking about the little nuances that I feel in the force feedback in each of those sim titles. But yeah, I really can't emphasize enough just how much difference the software really does make, particularly that new interpolation filter. As I mentioned at the start of the video, as well as when we were talking about the software itself, the data that actually comes out of the sim is so important, and the interpolation that takes place in between packets of data really can make the difference between something that feels quite robotic and something that feels really silky smooth and beautiful. And I think that is a big part of the reason why there's a few people out there that say that the Club Sport wheelbases felt a little bit more refined than the direct drive wheelbases did from Fanatec in the earlier days with the older drivers. I think Fanatec were really still sort of, ironing out all those little kinks and really sort of getting things right. And I really feel like this new driver is a massive step forward. So hopefully this video has been insightful and useful to you guys. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. And yeah, as I said in the video, if there are any details that you want any more information on, let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to do further videos where we can address those in a little bit more detail for you guys. So thank you very much for watching. As always, hit the thumbs up button if you've enjoyed the video. Make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out test drive video tomorrow. And yeah, I'll see you guys again soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.